Let's get started again. And so I want to make a quick announcement because it's a full room, which we absolutely love. However, we do have an overflow room in Cour L130. Downstairs, I'll be outside in and out of the room so I can help direct people, but I will hand it over to our moderator, Alex Alvarez, to take it from here.
All right. How was lunch, everyone? Everyone get their fill? Good. Well, it's good to see you all back. And if you remember from the earlier session, I talked a little bit about organizations, right? We all live and work within institutions and organizations that in part shape what we do and how we do it and so forth. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce this next panel that is all about authoritarianism and institutional complicity. And I'm going to introduce both of our distinguished panelists. They will present, and then we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. So first, let me introduce Steve Remy, is a professor of history at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College, and the Graduate Center, a scholar of modern European and German history. He is the author of The Heidelberg Myth, The Nazification and Denazification of a German University, The Malmedy Massacre, the War Crimes Trial Controversy, and War Crimes, Law, Politics, and Armed Conflict in the Modern World. Next, Meghan Riley. She received her PhD in Modern European History from Indiana University in May 2025. She studies the intersection of Holocaust studies and global humanitarianism. Her current book project explores the work of American relief organizations in French internment camps from 1939 to 1942. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University. Please join me in making welcome both of our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Alex. I'd like to thank Stan Mervis, and we go back a ways to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, Tim and all the organizers. But most of all, I'd like to thank you. It's a beautiful day. You just had lunch. The student panel was terrific and inspiring, and that's a very tough act to follow. I'll do my best to be as engaging as possible. So over the last decade, several prominent historians, and most of them Americans, have revisited the demise of the Weimar Republic, the ascent of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to power, and the consolidation of the dictatorship. So there's Tim Ryback, Peter Fritzsche, my colleague at CUNY, Benjamin Carter-Hett, the German historian Volker Ulrich. And their books and articles were clearly inspired by present-day concerns about the worldwide eclipse of democracy and the resurgence of nationalist authoritarianism. And they focused on either a small number of powerful men or the wider German public. And today I'll talk about the space in between, that is institutions, and one institution in particular, Germany's universities. We can start with two basic facts. First is that every significant institution in Germany conformed rapidly and willingly to the new regime. The second is that institutions played critically important roles in the genocides of the handicapped, of Jews, and of Roma and Sinti peoples. Germany's universities were no exceptions. Another big point I want to make is that the attempt by the Nazi regime to remake the human landscape of Germany and Europe was, to a significant extent, a massive bureaucratic enterprise, one requiring a high level of expertise in the sciences, and that includes the humanities and the social sciences. And scholars did not play a supporting role here, but a central one. I want to zero in on the period from 1933 to 1936, a period that encompasses the creation of the dictatorship and the Nazification of the universities. And I'll focus on one of them, Heidelberg University. It's the oldest university in Germany. It's a provincial university in the southwestern state of Baden, but one that had, by the 20s and early 30s, really earned reputation as a really cosmopolitan kind of place with a relatively large number of liberal professors on the faculty. What often gets left out of that is that there was a really powerful right-wing presence also. I'll focus on Heidelberg, but its experience is typical of all of Germany's 22 universities. All German universities then were state institutions. So just very quick bit of context. In general, in the years leading up to 1933, the general political outlook among the faculty and many students was anti-liberal. And this was an outlook that had only intensified after World War I. And it was particularly true of a younger generation of scholars facing dim career prospects. And some of the people I'm referring to here are some of the figures that Alex Albert has talked about earlier. I'll get to them if I have time. And while the Nazi Party found few recruits among the older generation of professors, members of this younger cohort proved more willing to engage with the far right, as did many students. In 1932, Germany's Organization of University Students was the first national institution in the country to freely elect Nazis to its leadership. Now, everything changes when Hitler is appointed chancellor in January 1933. So how did most professors respond, and students respond to the new regime? First of all, most professors welcomed it in 1933 and responded to the purges of their Jewish colleagues with near total silence. This is lovely Heidelberg. It was captured intact by the Americans in the spring of 1945, making it somewhat unusual among German universities is that it wasn't damaged. Hitler detested intellectuals, and Nazi Party officials believed that they had good reason to distrust Germany's professors. As I mentioned, on the whole, professors were politically conservative on the whole, but only about a dozen had joined the party before 1933. Now, it turns out that the regime's mistrust was unjustified. The dominant response of professors who had not been fired was strong enthusiasm for the regime and a willingness to serve it. Their support was more than a matter of political orientation. Various intellectual and scientific or pseudoscientific currents that predated 1933 not only informed Nazi ideology, but they flowed into the post-1933 university, and now they enjoyed official support and legal cover. Now, at the same time, the possibility of opposition became increasingly difficult and increasingly dangerous. Now, as for their silence, as hundreds of their Jewish colleagues were fired, I found this telling assessment in the then unpublished memoirs of the Heidelberg botanist Gerda von Ubisch. Now, she was the first woman in the state of Baden to complete a dissertation and receive state permission to teach at a university. She was fired in 1935 on so-called racial grounds, and she wrote, okay, one asks oneself, how is it possible that the universities did not speak out against this law? That they did not unanimously speak up for their colleagues? If all university professors, doctors, jurists had done this, if all had gone on strike, this law could have never been carried out. In their heart of hearts, many Germans were anti-Semites. And each one had one more or less large circle of Jews that he knew well and that he accepted as exceptions, while he rejected the Jews in principle. There were many among the university professors who found that there were too many Jews among the instructors. Now, second, professors put their knowledge, their abilities, and prestige at the regime's service. The willingness of non-Jewish academics to serve the regime manifested in practical and in symbolic terms. In practical terms, it meant that several thousand scholars and scientists would deploy their expertise in direct support of the regime's institutions and policies. As physicians, as physicists, anthropologists, historians, demographers, legal and political theorists, scholars of languages and literature, economists, and so on. And it meant that they would teach students and run laboratories. Now, in symbolic terms, this willingness contributed to the regime's legitimacy in Germany and abroad, and hopefully I'll have time to say a little bit more about that later. This is what the regime expected. Nazi Party officials demanded that universities serve the German people, now defined in terms of race. Nazi ideologues called this demand the German spirit in science. The German spirit was fundamentally opposed to traditions of research and teaching pioneered at German universities and instituted in the Western world. In that, first, it rejected the possibility of objectivity in scholarship. Second, it declared that the purpose of scholarship was first and foremost to serve the German people, now defined in terms of race. And third, it was opposed to hyper-specialization in scholarly fields. One Nazi Heidelberg professor derided this as a heap of disconnected specialties. The Nazis in German universities turned out to be pioneers in interdisciplinary research. At the heart of this conception was race. So an individual scholar's race determined how that scholar looked at the world. And as representatives of a so-called inferior race, Jews were incapable of examining the world honestly and accurately. It was a form of identity politics. The period from 1936 to 1939 was a transformative one for Heidelberg and other universities. In just 3 years, professors in every discipline embraced the German spirit in scholarship. Let me just give you one example from Heidelberg's medical faculty. Throughout Germany, a relatively large number of physicians joined the Nazi Party or became enthusiastic supporters, which is a point that Alex made earlier. Medical scientists developed and disseminated Nazi race theories in their classrooms and publications and were designers and perpetrators of some of the regime's most heinous crimes, principally medical murder, so-called euthanasia, and experiments performed on concentration camp, death camp inmates. During the years of Nazi rule, Heidelberg's medical faculty would contain a higher percentage of party members than any other. In 1934, the psychiatrist Karl Schneider became the chair. Now, he had been a party member since 1932, but he was appointed to this position mainly because of his qualifications as a scientist. This is important. He had published extensively on psychiatry in the 20s, and in 1930 he had produced a well-regarded study of schizophrenia. He also became the head of the state of Baden's racial policy office, and this nexus of university-based scientific expertise and state power is a good example of the way that, in which professors serve the regime outside the universities. Now, in Heidelberg's medical faculty, the previous director and 3 instructors in the psychiatry clinic had been fired. So that allowed Schneider to surround himself with devoted assistants, and a number of them go on to distinguished careers in West and East Germany, completely unimpeded by the past association with their mentor or their own complicity in medical crimes. Schneider and other professors published books and articles and delivered lectures on so-called race science. But they did more than that. In line with the regime's hereditary protection law, which required the forced sterilization of men and women deemed by the regime to be mentally or physically disabled, I discovered that 285 sterilizations were performed at the university's women's clinic in 1934 and 1935. Now, Schneider would go on to become one of the physicians recruited by the regime to plan and advise the program known as Operation T4, which Alex talked a little bit about. That is, of systematically murdering handicapped Germans. And he also became one of the program's leading researchers. His objective was to obtain a steady supply of patients to examine and experiment upon before and after they were murdered. He established his clinic at Heidelberg as one of 2 major research centers. And with funds from the regime, he expanded his facilities to 2 state hospitals, one of which functioned as a killing center for children. The hospital, in turn, provided Schneider and his colleagues and students with a steady supply of human subjects and of particular interest to Schneider, their brains. Now, not surprisingly, the Heidelberg Clinic became an important training center for other T4 specialists. Now, the case of Schneider was extreme but not exceptional. The institutionalization of the German spirit from 1933 to 1936 bore even more poisonous fruit during the war. Beginning in 1939, scholars from thoroughly Nazified disciplines contributed their prestige and expertise to the war through publications and lectures, through planning the exploitation and resettlement of conquered territories, through developing weapons and weapons-related technologies, and through medical experiments and mass murder. Significant individual or organized resistance by professors and students was rare, and in the case of professors, almost non-existent. Okay, so why? Why did professors conform so readily and in many cases with considerable commitment and enthusiasm? First, the regime's promise to restore Germany to greatness resonated with the conservative nationalist orientation of the vast majority of professors. Contemporary academia in America would be unrecognizable to them. Most despised the liberal democratic republic, and they resented the post-World War I settlement. Second, to be sure, there was the coercive effect of fear, and I don't want to disregard that. Fear, not just of what the state might do, but of Nazi students. They were very well organized nationally and at all universities. And Heidelberg was really a nest of a number of Nazi student leaders who would go on to become, in many cases, SS officers in the context that Alex talked about earlier. They were very aggressive, and they proved willing to harass and denounce professors they didn't like. But I should point out that while their ideological commitment was intimidating, it's also clear that for many professors it was energizing and inspiring. Third, the evidence is clear that opportunism and opportunity did play a role, and Carl Schneider's career is a case in point, but it's not exceptional. So engaging in regime-sponsored research came with tangible benefits: financial resources, legal cover, and career advancement. And for some, particularly in medical faculties, there was the chance to conduct research without legal or ethical restrictions. They did it because they could. The intersection of opportunity and ideology was of particular significance to a younger generation of scholars. That is, men, often from middle-class backgrounds or lower middle-class backgrounds, who faced a dismal academic job market in the years leading up to 1933. And these men belonged to a generational cohort that the German historian Michael Wild characterized as the uncompromising generation. That is, men born between 1900 and 1910, so they were too young to have served in World War I, and many of them felt that they had missed out on a really significant experience, who then went on to become committed Nazis. They became committed Nazis in part because they had grown up during the deprivations of World War I and amidst all of the turmoil and instability of the Weimar years. And a small but important number of them attended universities, and they often earned doctorates in political science or law, and they became active in Nazi student groups in the later years of the 20s and in the early 30s, and then before joining the SS, to serve as bureaucrats and in some cases mass murderers. And then most who survived the war integrated with little disruption into West German society. So let me return for just a minute to the symbolic significance of institutional complicity. There's Heidelberg's famous castle. Anybody here been to Heidelberg? Okay. All right. The convergence of the regime's expectations and the professors' willingness to meet them was on full public display at Heidelberg in the summer of 1936. Now, that year marked the 550th anniversary of the university's founding, and the regime chose this occasion to host an international celebration of this famous institution and the German spirit and scholarship. Hitler himself declared the event to be of national significance, but the intended audience was also international. Now, the timing of this, I should note, was very significant. Germany was rearming and violating the provisions of the post-World War I peace conference, but at that moment, it was in the regime's interest to present itself to the world as leading a proud and peace-seeking nation. So one way to do this was to host the Olympics, which Germany did, both the Winter and Summer Games in 1936, but also to host a high-profile international celebration at a well-known university. And the spectacle that takes place at Heidelberg in June 1936, it was unique in the history of the experience of German universities in the Third Reich. And the event included ceremonies, tours, speeches, and the bestowal of honorary degrees on foreign scholars. That's the main square of Heidelberg. Above the university, above the portal, you have this garish Nazi style eagle that replaced a statue of Athena holding a genius. And you can see here, Den Deutschen Geist, the dedication of the building means dedicated to the German spirit. And recipients of honorary degrees, they were selected by the now thoroughly Nazified faculties, and they were chosen on the basis of their non-Jewishness and their commitment to the ideals of the German spirit, particularly its racialist foundations. Now, Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister and who earned his doctorate at Heidelberg, gave a speech at a gala event at the castle, and he wrote in his diary that his remarks were met by thunderous applause from the assembled guests, most of the university's faculty among them. And here's the representative Carleton College with Rector Wilhelm Groh, the president of the chancellor, in June. The largest delegation of university representatives came from the United States. All British universities declined the invitation, as did a number of other European universities, Oslo, Leiden, and others. Now, not everybody was fooled, including Victor Klemperer, a linguist who had been fired on racial grounds from the Technical University in Dresden, who wrote in his diary in August, if one day the situation were reversed and the fate of the vanquished lay in my hands, then I would let all the ordinary folk go and even some of the leaders. But I would have the intellectuals strung up and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest, and they would be left hanging from the lampposts for as long as was compatible with hygiene. I got to read that quote when I gave a talk on my book at Heidelberg. That was fun. Last thing I'll say is, I'll add, is that the decision of Columbia University's president, Nicholas Murray Butler, to send a representative to Heidelberg provoked a scathing commentary from the university's student newspaper, The Spectator. It's still very much worth going back and reading the commentary. And also student protests. Now, Butler admired the Nazis, and like his peers at other Ivy League institutions, he was an anti-Semite. He thought there were far too many Jews at Columbia and other schools. And he personally had the leader of the student protests expelled. So I think I'll just close with this. In the wake of the protests, the New York Times editorial pointed out that the learned visitors who come to Heidelberg will become, in the hands of Nazi propagandists, a foreign endorsement of something far different from the Heidelberg idea or the university idea. The Times missed the point. They missed an essential point. Their assumption was that the universities had been taken over by a bunch of hacks and pseudo-scientists and then betrayed the ideal of the universities and suppressed real scholarship. The reality was way worse. The reality was that one could be a scientist, one could be an intellectual, one could be an artist, one could be a brilliant filmmaker, and an ideologue at the same time. And one could possess a high level of technical and bureaucratic competence. These three things together made the Holocaust ultimately possible. Thank you very much.
I want to begin by first thanking the organizers for having me here today, and thanking you all for coming, especially the undergraduates. It's wonderful to see so many of your young, shining faces here as we explore these themes. So today I want to explore this panel's theme of authoritarianism and institutional complicity by discussing perhaps two case studies of this kind of complicity from the event that my research focuses on, which is the Holocaust. Specifically, today I'll be briefly discussing the work of two American humanitarian organizations who worked in the concentration camps of Vichy, France from 1939 to 1942, when the deportations from these camps to Auschwitz began and carried over 10,000 people to their deaths. I'm not coming into today's talk with any kind of theoretical orientation or scaffolding, and I don't think I'll be departing this talk with having devised any new kind of theoretical way to help us understand how different institutions work with or accommodate authoritarian regimes. Instead, my talk today will explore some of the incentives and challenges faced by and choices made by two American relief organizations as they worked with the authoritarian Vichy regime to help the internees within the regime's concentration camps, and in doing so became instrumental in administering and keeping operational those camps. First, I need to begin with some really important historical context to help explain France's wartime experience, as well as the emergence and nature of the French camps. And some of you are already familiar with this history, so I just ask that you bear with me. The camps I'll be talking about today originated as refugee camps for refugees from the Spanish Civil War, which began and ended prior to the Second World War. 1939, in January, February, Barcelona falls, and in response, about 500,000 Spaniards fleeing Franco's nationalist forces crossed the Pyrenees into the southwest corner of France. With them came some humanitarians, including American ones who've been working with them in Spain. This about 500,000 refugees end up in makeshift refugee camps in the southwest corner of France, as you can kind of see where they're clustered here. These camps were devised in an ad hoc way, and the conditions were terrible. And the French government, which was then the Democratic Third Republic, had very little interest in appropriately provisioning them or dealing with this refugee crisis that are now come crashing onto their shores. The conditions in these camps were so bad that some Spaniards just went right back to Spain, even though they would be in terrible danger there because of their political beliefs. Despite these challenges over the course of 1939, some of the camps are somewhat provisioned, some buildings are built, and systems are put in place to help bring in food and other resources to the camps. And present in part of the process of making these camps more habitable were a variety of international and American aid organizations. On September 1st, 1939, World War II begins. Nothing much happens on the Western Front, but because France and Germany are now at war, tens of thousands of refugees who had fled Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia into France over the previous 6 years were now interned as enemy aliens in these French internment camps. Most of these refugees from Germany and France were Jews, or political dissidents, or both, but they were now interned in France as enemy aliens. This is the first kind of big change in what the camps were, as they're now refugee camps with kind of an internment function laid over them. The situation again changes in May 1940 when Germany invades and quickly conquers Western Europe. In June 1940, France surrenders, and the country is actually split in two. The occupied zone is up north, and it's called the occupied zone because it's under direct German military occupation. This is the most economically productive part of France. It also has this coastline that faces Britain and that must be secured militarily. It's very sensitive. The unoccupied zone is in the south. It's nominally independent. The unoccupied zone controls France's colonies, conducts foreign policy, including diplomatic relations with the United States, and carries out internal reforms designed to purge France of left-wing elements, Jews, modernity more broadly. This is an authoritarian regime ran by Philippe Pétain, who is a very old war hero from World War I. It's headquartered in the spa town of Vichy, and it is nominally independent, but it exists at the pleasure of the Germans. Following the fall of France, several laws are passed that increase the number of refugees eligible to be interned in these camps, which have now really left the refugee camp function behind and are fully internment or concentration camps. Most of the Spaniards have left at this point. The camp's population fluctuates wildly over the next few years, but increasingly it is increasingly Jewish, non-French, and poor. If you were a Jewish refugee of means, there were mechanisms by which you could not be interned, but this was a population that was increasingly impoverished. Like with many camps in the Reich, the number and definition of camps in France is a bit variable, but this map gives us a sense of the largest camps in the unoccupied zone. And it's worth noting that there were many different types of camps in Nazi Europe. The camps I'm talking about today were not the death camps like those in Poland, and they were not as punitive as those in Germany like Dachau. If you had to be interned in a Nazi or Nazi-aligned camp on the continent during this time, the French camps were the least punitive, the least intentionally deadly. Still, there were desperately bad conditions in the camps: terrible hygiene, sanitation, insufficient food, heat, clothing, and medical care. And this real quick is a picture of Baton. And this is a picture that kind of communicates the ethos of the National Revolution, which was designed to purify and rejuvenate France, moving it from this collapsing house over there with a Star of David up top to a more orderly, conservative, and pure regime. In and around the camps in France was a space of dense, energetic, global humanitarian activity, much of which was either staffed and or funded by Americans. So as I mentioned, some of these relief workers followed Spanish refugees over the border. Others came later because of the well-publicized humanitarian disaster the camps quickly became. The situation of the camps is not a secret. You could read about in the New York Times if you were so inclined. The humanitarians were not just around the camps or sending supplies in, but they physically entered the camps repeatedly and regularly. Some organizations actually had barracks in the camps from which they worked and lived. The nature of their work was almost everything. They sent in food, medical supplies, clothing, psychosocial care, immigration aid. They transmitted money from usually relatives in America into the camps. They facilitated communications between internees and relatives abroad. In some camps, they even provided the supplies for the camp's physical plant: mattresses, heating supplies, glass in the window panes. The list can go on and on. This humanitarian work required collaboration with camp, prefectural, and national authorities. And my project argues that the work of American humanitarians was so essential to the functioning of these camps that the humanitarians essentially unofficially administered the camps or co-administered them. This is a list of organizations that were working kind of together to centralize their efforts to help the Jews in the camps. And I've included this list right here because it shows a sample of the number of groups involved in some capacity on the camps. This organization, the Name Committee, had 36 members from the United States or elsewhere in Europe or Canada. The image right here is of children at a hotel turned internment camp in Marseille called the Bompard. The sign says, "The Quaker children of Bompard, thank you." This image was created and circulated among American donors to inspire them to open up their wallets. Now I want to turn to talk about two of the three American humanitarian organizations that my book project primarily studies, and discuss how they engage with the Vichy regime at various levels. Underwriting much of the humanitarian activity in the camps, which were increasingly populated by German and Austrian Jews, was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint. Founded during the First World War, the Joint was the premier expression of bourgeois American Jewish philanthropy, and it strove to be present wherever in the world Jews were suffering, including in the camps of Vichy France. Overall, the Joint spent about 1/3 of its wartime budget in France. Because of Vichy's open anti-Semitism, the Joint did not have a large personnel presence in the country. Instead, the organization worked largely by funding other groups in and around the camps, including French Jewish organizations and American non-Jewish organizations. Much of the food, medical care, clothing, furniture, physical plant, kitchen equipment, and other resources that kept the camps operable as spaces of internment were therefore financed by the donations of American Jews. Joint personnel had little direct contact with Vichy officials, and overall the organization, which was based in New York, had a clear-eyed view on the nature of the Vichy regime, even if it could not imagine the internees' ultimate fate. Still, until the deportations of August 1942, the Joint strictly followed almost all Vichy laws, because following the regime's laws allowed them to continue to operate in the country and serve the Jews interned therein. Nevertheless, perhaps more than any other American group operating in France during this time, the Joint wrestled internally with its close, if indirect, collaboration with the Vichy regime. Ultimately, its desire to help the Jews of France overrode its very real moral qualms. Its executives most clearly articulated the organization's position in summer 1942, prior to the start of the deportations. They wrote, "The position of the Joint should be guided chiefly by philanthropic considerations. Provided that the funds with which we place at the disposal of local committees are to the last franc remitted according to their appropriation, we have no reason to refuse our cooperation. It is easy to take decisions of principle when one is not in touch with reality. Today, however, the reality is that such a stoppage of our activities will practically mean the stoppage of all kinds of relief to old people, women, children, sick, and other persons in want. The second group I'll be talking about today is the American Friends Service Committee, which was and still is the humanitarian arm of the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. The AFSC was created in 1917 to provide an outlet for American pacifist conscientious objectors during the First World War. Over the next 2 decades, it expanded in reach and stature. Its leaders worked closely with the Roosevelt administration, including Eleanor Roosevelt herself, on projects domestically, and it assumed the role of the United States' unofficial humanitarian representatives during the Spanish Civil War, when it provided relief to civilians on both sides, including foodstuff donated by the American government. The organization's ubiquity during the Spanish Civil War meant that its representatives traveled across the Pyrenees with Spanish refugees and were present among that population even before the camps existed. The Quakers were undoubtedly the most important American relief organization on the ground. They were the most respected, the best funded, and the most numerous. They were involved in almost every facet of camp life, and they also pursued a variety of relief projects across Vichy France. They were also the most enthusiastic collaborators with Vichy officials at all levels. They formed warm, collaborative relationships with camp commandants and administrators, and the group's European director greatly admired Marshal Philippe Pétain and once spent a weekend with him undertaking various engagements across France. The Quakers saw themselves as essentially co-administering the camps. At one point, one ambitious Quaker delegate looked into formally taking over a camp, although that plan ultimately went nowhere. The Quakers operated with supreme confidence in their abilities and in their relationships with the Roosevelt administration and with Vichy. They viewed themselves as working to engineer better Franco-American relations, and they scrupulously followed all Vichy laws in order to ensure that their work in the camps was able to continue. Influenced by their liberal Christian tradition, which rejected racism, the Quakers never engaged with the fact that the majority of those interned in the camps were Jews. Instead, they referred to the internees as refugees, Central Europeans, Germans, stateless, or internees. They only began to refer to the internees as Jews or non-Aryans once the deportations began. The Quakers' closeness with the Vichy regime and their inability to perceive their Jewish charges as being Jews led them to be blindsided by the deportations, which began in August 1942. Before I get to the deportations, it's worth asking, why did the Vichy regime play ball? Why did they permit this kind of activity in some of their most sensitive spaces of internment and of human rights violations? And I think there are 3 reasons. First is that the humanitarians were already there by the time France fell. I think there's something to be said about the power of inertia. The humanitarians were already well established in the camps, and that was kind of the foundation going forward. Second is that the regime could offload the work of caring for the internees onto the humanitarians. The regime had no intentions to murder the internees, at least until August 1942. The camps were not designed to be murderous. They were designed to be somewhat livable, and any kind of way that the regime could make someone else do that is a win on their book. The third reason is the most important, is that the Vichy was very, very concerned with cultivating a positive image in the United States and earning the support of the United States, with whom Vichy France had diplomatic relations. They had geopolitical concerns for this because France still had colonial possessions in the Caribbean. The United States, as a neutral country, could legitimize the regime. And there was a shared sense that the United States represented the future, no matter what course the war took. And it was in the best interests of France to align themselves with that future. Therefore, allowing the humanitarians to work in the camps allowed the regime to project an image of benevolence and to cultivate closer relations with America. The humanitarians were not unaware of this. This was the unspoken bargain they made with the regime to continue their work in the camps. And the image here is from Liberation, but it conveys the spirit of the slide. So the American humanitarians worked with all levels of the Vichy regime to facilitate their works in the camps from 1939 through the deportations, which began in August 1942. Between August 6th and November 11th, 1942, 11,012 Jewish men, women, and some children were deported from the camps in southern France to Auschwitz via the transit camp of Drancy outside of Paris. This is about 1/11 of the total deportees from France during the Holocaust, and the overwhelming majority of them were murdered immediately upon arrival in Auschwitz. The humanitarians were present and active during the deportations. They performed many tasks. They advocated for the internees at the highest levels of the American and French governments, including with Philippe Pétain, but their most meaningful work happened on the ground. They provided emotional support for those slated for deportation. They passed out food, fresh and canned food, for those boarding the trains. They took possessions of the deportees' luggage and money for safekeeping. They placed boxes of books on the cattle cars for reading edification, which was a misreading of the situation. At times, their relief efforts shaded into rescue. Some workers began to smuggle children out of the camps, and this became more and more common. Probably their most emotionally taxing activity was that children under 18 were initially exempt from the deportation order, assuming they were given into the custody of the groups. And so many humanitarians spent a lot of time convincing parents to relinquish custody of their children, so the children would not be deported, at least initially. And this did save some children's lives. And the image here is of a Swiss truck delivering supplies to the deportees, who are to the left of the vehicles. Most troublingly, my research has found that the humanitarians participated in decision-making around who was to be deported. The deportation order contained 11 exempted categories. These exempted categories changed over time. And in order to kind of assess who on the deportation lists fell into one of these categories and who did not, American humanitarians participated in what were called screening commissions. Following the creation of deportation lists by camp and prefectural authorities, aid workers and clergy worked on the commissions alongside French authorities to see who in the list fell into one of these categories and could be at least temporarily not deported. Of course, the flip side of that is affirming people who were eligible for deportation. These commissions usually played out in a scene of everyone on the list would come forward, show their documents, and the commission would kind of argue and see if this person could be spared, at least temporarily, or if they would go on the trains. Thus, the humanitarians played important roles in deciding who would be deported and who would not, at least temporarily. This is undoubtedly the most troubling aspect of their work in the French camps during the Holocaust, but it's also a microcosm of their larger commitments and larger choices they made in the camps. Like I said at the beginning, I don't have any theoretical intervention to make today or any grand pronouncements about the themes of our panel. Part of why is that this is obviously very complex stuff, whether you're looking at it from the perspective of a study of the Holocaust or the study of humanitarianism. And another part of it is just that I'm still working on it as I revise my dissertation into a book. However, I thank you all for your attention, and I welcome any thoughts or questions you may have about how we should assess interactions between humanitarian organizations and the authoritarian regimes in which they often work. Thank you.
Thank you guys for being here. This question's for Steve Remy. So I've heard an argument that as a result of the Weimar Republic maintaining their conservative judges, that the Republic was doomed from the start. Now, I won't say so with such definitive terms, but do you think that the impact of influential conservative or anti-liberal elements in the judiciary and academia made the Weimar Republic unequal or uniquely vulnerable to authoritarianism, Nazi or otherwise? If so, could this inevitability have been avoided?
I wouldn't use the term inevitable, right? But you're onto something, absolutely. I mean, there's an old line now discredited by historians that the Weimar Republic was a republic without Republicans. That's not true at all. It is true that the judiciary was absolutely stacked against the Republic, and that reflected more generally the conservative, anti-liberal orientation of Germany's powerful civil service. And the record is clear. In fact, before the Nazis came to power, there was a professor of statistics at Heidelberg who, well, he had 2 strikes against him. He was liberal and he was Jewish, or 3 actually, and he had the temerity of compiling statistics about the decisions, court decisions on cases of political violence. How did courts come down on the right and how did courts come down on the left? And yeah, but, pardon me, the numbers are clear and they probably go in the way that you would think. The judiciary was far harder on perpetrators of violence on the political left than they were on the right. Emil Gumbel was the name of the statistician I mentioned, and even before the Nazis came to power, he was hounded out of the university for the profile that he had made for himself in calling attention to this political judicial disparity in the Republic. Look, that said, inevitable no. The Republic had certain weaknesses in the Constitution. Alex mentioned this earlier. In this unrepentant and inflexible anti-liberal position in a lot of important segments in German society. But it was also murdered, killed off, and really relatively very quickly. So I'm not going to go so far as to say inevitable, but what you're talking about definitely has a basis in reality.
So, something that came to my mind when you were when you were talking about what happened with the aid workers in the Vichy camps, and this isn't so much about aid workers, but more so about institutional complicity. I forget the name of the company, but there was a French company that was found guilty of profiteering off of off of the violence that ISIS was committing in West Asia. And obviously in that case it was a pretty mainstream institution. It was a business, but in the same way, there's plenty of businesses that are currently involved in different genocides in multiple countries. And I guess my question is, how do you hold these institutions accountable, particularly when they're maybe this is a 2-part question, both when they're publicly accountable, whether that's to a government that is committing the act, or whether they're accountable to their donors who ultimately are relying on the PR that they produce in order to continue to fund them?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think I think we do have to treat businesses that are for-profit enterprises differently than we have to treat humanitarian organizations. And I think it's a much more clear-cut verdict on how we should approach businesses that are embroiled in genocidal activities then or now. There's been a lot of work about Nazi Germany and the business collaboration that made their crimes possible. So I had not thought very deeply about businesses and genocide then or now, but my first impulse is to say, if you are a for-profit enterprise and you're making a profit off of someone else's suffering or death, then you are responsible. The humanitarians, obviously they were taking photographs, they were producing what we today call content about their work and about the refugees in order to drum up donations. And this is kind of a long-term tension in humanitarian work, is that often humanitarian organizations, they need donations to survive, and they often get donations by publicizing, photographs of starving children or people at their very lowest moments, photographs that really objectify the people they are photographing. And so this is a long-term tension that the humanitarians that I study were not able to figure out. And it kind of goes back to this uncomfortable core, is that they have to generate some kind of money in order to do their work, and often generating that money requires engaging in at least some ethically unsavory publicity activities. And yeah, so what you tapped on here is kind of a larger tension in the history and in the current practice of humanitarianism that no one's been able to square that circle.
So my question first to Steve concerns Heidegger. The famous speech, not Heidelberg, right? But he's in another university, but his famous speech when he becomes the director of the university. Can you comment on it? Is it really about the German spirit, or is it something much deeper, which would be Western philosophy begins with Plato? So there's a Platonic kind of an understanding who is a philosopher king, and he's going to play out that role.
Sure. The references to the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was then at Freiburg University and was one of the highest visibility German academics to become a Nazi. And like a large number of professors, he when the regime came to power, gave high visibility speeches about the new responsibility of the universities in the new Germany. Now, in the case of Heidegger, and one of the things that we've learned recently about Heidegger, thanks to the work of largely the work of my colleague at the CUNY Graduate Center, Richard Wolin, but also the French historian Emmanuel Faye. Heidegger was not only was politically thoroughly a Nazi and long beyond just 1933 and this initial burst of nationalist enthusiasm for the Nazis, but a convincing one in my view, it can be made that the core of Heidegger's very philosophy was deeply Nazified in the years of the regime and then beyond. Now, this is a debatable point, although I think less debatable now that Heidegger's infamous notebooks have been made available. And again, I commend anybody interested in this to the work of Richard Wolin. So I think there's two things going on here, right? There's a political presence at this important moment when the regime comes to power, in which Heidegger and others are saying we are ready to serve, and it is the responsibility of scholars to serve the German spirit. And he's just one of a large number of professors who make statements like this. But for him, like so many others, Carl Schneider and others, the German spirit goes much deeper than just this initial promotion.
So the question to you would be about the moral ambiguity of the situation of any organization that tries to help. So I don't know if you thought about the similarity and differences between what they were doing, the humanitarian organizations in those internment camps, and what the Judenrat was doing. In a sense, it's kind of very, very similar, unfortunately. But to some extent, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So kind of a lot of people were helped, definitely by the joint, big time. So I would hate to think about the joint in negative terms if I follow the logic of your project.
Thank you. You've hit upon the central issue that has bedeviled me this whole time and probably will continue to bedevil me in the future. is that how do we understand the moral implications of their actions? How do we judge them? Is our place to judge, etc.? And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if I will. I both intellectually and personally. Intellectually, because we can try to, the closest comparison I found is Judenrat. Of course, the American humanitarians were different in that they could just leave. They were not fully in danger themselves. If they really had a problem with their activities, they could depart. The Judenrat had no choice. So that's the best comparison I found, but I don't think it's still one-to-one. And what I have found that the humanitarians, they scramble our notions of collaboration, of the bystander, of rescue, all these kind of fundamental notions that structure our understanding of the Holocaust. And of course, my pitch, if you were interviewing me for a job, which you all should, is that, my work forces us to rethink these categories from this very unique perspective. But the downside to that is that it's really hard to do that rethinking. Then from a personal level, I really struggled with how to approach this, because I have to, it's very easy to judge someone when you're writing your dissertation in your Lululemon leggings, in your air-conditioned apartment in 2023. It's very easy to make moral judgments. But I kind of come down to the fact that these people have done more to make the world a better place than I have, by far. And I should give them the benefit of the doubt, even if some humanitarians, especially in the leadership, especially of the Quakers, were a little too quick to cozy up to people who I find reprehensible. So I guess to summarize that is that I don't know, and I don't know if I ever will know. Yes.
Hello. My question's for Steve Remy. I'm curious, I'm sure we've all seen, I've definitely seen a lot of academics and professors not really feel comfortable with expressing too much political opinions in their class or their published work, and not really comfortable with pushing bounds of what's considered academic. Do you think that system that we've set up makes it more difficult for things like fascism to rise in universities where there's not extremist language pushed? Or do you think it makes it easier because all these professors have to fall in line with what's considered the standard curriculum?
It's a really interesting question. And look, I think that I'll just speak to the American where I spent my career, the American university setting in the humanities and social sciences in particular. There has been a long-standing and troubling and self-defeating lack of viewpoint diversity. All right, and to some extent, we are paying the price for that now. Now, I want to be clear that I know where the blame lies primarily, but we have to look at ourselves. Too many professors have become political activists for one particular cause, and not that long ago, cancel culture was a real thing. Anybody says who it wasn't doesn't know what they're talking about, and. So I'm no fan of Charlie Kirk, but there was part of his critique and others that have been made, some from conservatives, some from liberals, that is not off the mark. I think the best compliment I ever received as a professor came some years ago. A student came up to me at the end of a course and said, "Look, some of us are trying to figure out where you stand politically, and we can't do it. So can you just please tell me?" I said, "No." So, first of all, it's not relevant. And second, I just spent 14 weeks trying to, there was the subject matter, but also trying to get you to think for yourselves and work things out for yourselves. And what I think on one particular issue or another issue doesn't matter, or shouldn't matter. And I hope before I retire, somebody else says something that like that to me again. I would like very much to hear that again. But I'm editorializing now, but it's a great question.
So a question for you, starting with Remy, it's also kind of related to the contemporary. As you were saying, how in the university, many of the professors and the students joined the Nazi Party or supported the Nazi Party, increasingly during the 1930s. Relating that to the contemporary, many students, although not as extreme as it was in Nazi Germany, are moving more and more towards the far right.
Yeah.
However, it's seen that professors are not as much. I was wondering if you know, at least right now, if there's any disconnect between professors and students, the reason why one group is moving more to the right, one group isn't, even though we could definitely say that compared to Weimar Germany, that we have many of the same issues as like less jobs for students who are graduating going on, inflation is a problem, rising prices and everything. With it being similar situations, what is this disconnect that's happening currently?
Yeah, that's another great question. Look, the Heidelberg myth was published in 2002 or three, and I think this might be the third or fourth time now I've been asked to revisit it, and I know why. But in thinking about our current circumstances, something I remind my students of all the time is that historians, look, we're always being asked to link the past to the present, right? And I feel, in particular, for my colleagues who teach ancient history or medieval France, right? You know, that the publishers are trying to get them to tell us how 13th century France is like America now. It's not. Which is to say that our principal concern is to account for change over time, right? And there are huge contextual differences between past in the context that I'm talking about and the present. But you're onto something in that one of the things that I think is really worth tracking in contemporary academia in this context of eroded democracies and resurgent nationalist authoritarianism is how much energy is coming from students and from younger scholars. And I think that there is a lot. In the case of Germany, as in the case of the United States, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, the faculty is dominated by liberal and left-wing scholars. And I don't know what the situation is like at Arizona. I don't know if you have a chapter of what is it? Charlie Kirk's. Or Proud Boys. I don't know if it's Proud Boys. Yeah. No, that's right. Okay, that's embarrassing. I should have known that. But that's right. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the German context, especially as the AfD is just seems to be becoming stronger and stronger. Liberal and left-leaning universities and faculties are a target of the right because of how strong that presence is and how influential the universities and institutions are. I hope that does some justice to you.
And then for Dr. Riley, I know you're saying before 1942 in Vichy, France, how they weren't exactly concentration camps, but they were refugee camps, like internment camps. I'm not sure if you did like research on this as well, but comparing it to starting at the end of 1941 into 1942, so about the same period, when the United States established Japanese internment camps. I was wondering if you knew about the difference that were in conditions, the role of humanitarian groups inside of American Japanese internment camps, like just what did that look like?
Great question. The conditions in the internment camps for Japanese Americans were definitely much, much better. You didn't really have people dying of starvation or of infectious disease in the same, at least, or if they did, not like they did in France. I do know that several of the organizations I studied were very active in both protesting Japanese internment and then providing services for those interned, especially the Quakers. One of their biggest domestic wartime projects was around the Japanese internment camps.
This is more of a comment than a question. So I continue to hear people saying, in that situation, when you're there in the environment, how do you turn? To tell the truth, so I grew up in Rwanda, and I stayed in Rwanda until 1994. And I saw from 1990 to 1994, that's what I witnessed, but there were stuff before that. But from 1990 to 1994, there was a war going on. And only the environment you are in, the talks, what's on the radio, those things influence you. You don't even know it's happening. And you see people in your environment changing. And it's happening. To me, I see it. I tell people here, I'm like, you got a good thing going. But, it's very close to it's heading that way to where you start unhumanizing people. People who your friends are no longer your friends. And you feel that if they don't see things your way, they're the enemy, they're not good. Then when something triggers, you end up killing those people and you don't know where it came from. And once you kill once, it becomes addictive. And you start wondering what happened and how did you get there? It happened to me. I mean, luckily, my mom worked with the U.S. Embassy and I'm an American, so we got evacuated out of there by the U.S. But when I got here, I started realizing that my mind changed, my belief changed. And my parents never taught me that. And a lot of people in my environment, I saw how they changed, but I always kept to myself. But when I got here, I had to go through a process to change my mind where I'm not discriminating against a certain people. So it happens and you don't know it's happening until you are in an environment to actually recognize it. So, and that's where, when you're in that situation, somebody said, when you're in that situation, you have to do it because there's some people who commit genocide because they don't want to be killed. And they become genociders. And in that situation, it's where you got to make a decision. Am I going to stand up and not be killed or take a chance to be killed? Or am I going to have to do what they're doing so I survive? And that's a very difficult situation to be in. Thank you.
Any responses or?
If I could.
Go ahead.
Quickly, I think context is incredibly important. And Alex, you got into this a little bit in your talk, and the question that in the student panel that Sammy raised about neighbors turning on each other, I think when you were talking, I was thinking about that context, that's the question of context, and excuse me. For anyone interested, I think one of the richest places to explore this in terms of historical scholarship is the case of Poland in the mid to late 1930s. Work of Jan Gross at Princeton, Anna Bicont, and a whole younger generation of scholars who were looking at this very question. And I claim absolutely no expertise on the history of Rwanda and the genocide, and I would imagine there's scholarship on that issue. And I think that we're going to hear about Rwanda either tomorrow or
Sudan.
Sudan. I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. But neighbors turning on each other doesn't just happen. I think this is what the historical right. There is a context of to this, and in institutions too, like universities. Megan, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I think I'll let your excellent.
Well, I think we're about at time. Great questions and comments. Please join me once again in thanking our panelists.
Right.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break. Be back here at 2:15 for religion, authoritarianism, and genocide. I'm a religious studies professor, so I always look forward to the religion sections. So,
I know.
caffeinate, hydrate.
No,
You just had lunch, and I know sitting in a room for a little while after.